My husband filed for divorce the same day he got his $10 million inheritance. He placed the envelope on the kitchen table like it was a bill. No apology, no warning, just silence and the smell of lavender drifting in from the open window. The same morning he inherited $10 million, he handed me divorce papers. Not even a glance, just his coffee, his freedom, and the life we built, erased with a signature. Where are you listening from? Drop your city in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you've ever been blindsided by someone you trusted. They say Oregon rain is gentle, but that morning it felt like needles tapping the roof, sharp, steady, impossible to ignore. I sat at our old pine table watching droplets roll down the glass. The mug in my hand had a tiny chip on the rim. Callum always said we should throw it out. I never did. We bought this house in 2009. It was nothing back then. Just a frame of timber and hope. No insulation, no plumbing, just us two sleeping bags and a dog named Chester who barked at shadows. I remember the way Callum looked at the bare beams, like he could already see it: finished wooden floors, wide windows, a fire pit out back, where guests would sit and sip wine. He wanted to build something lasting. And I believed him. I left my teaching job to help. Took bookkeeping courses, learned property zoning, filed every permit, met every inspector. He handled the charm, I handled the logistics. For 14 years, we built not just a home, but a chain of eco-lodges along the Mackenzie. Locals started calling me Mrs. Whitmore, like I was part of a brand, not a marriage. And maybe I was. He handled the photo shoots, I handled the spreadsheets. He got the press, I got the bills paid. And I didn't mind, not then, because I believed that loyalty meant something. But loyalty, turns out, doesn't hold much weight when a trust fund gets unlocked. I saw it in his eyes that morning, not guilt, not regret. Relief, like the contract had finally expired, like I was a loan he could repay with silence. It wasn't the papers that hurt. It was how well he timed it, how easily he made me a footnote. And yet even then, part of me wanted to believe this was a mistake. That maybe something could still be salvaged. But by sunset, he had already moved his things upstairs. And I had already opened the drawer where we kept our original deed, the one that used to have both our names. It didn't anymore. It was a Tuesday. Mid-September, the kind of morning where the air smells like wet leaves and old paper. I was looking for a utility bill when I found it. A manila folder, thin, tucked behind a stack of expired insurance forms. Inside, a copy of the property transfer document for Whitmore Ridge Lodge. Stamped, filed, signed. Only one name appeared under current legal owner, Callum J. Whitmore. And then below the signature line, mine. Sharp, neat, confident. Except I didn't remember writing it. I stared at the ink like it would confess something. I flipped through my memory, no notary visit, no discussion, no coffee-stained morning where he slid the form across the table. Nothing. The last time I signed anything official was months ago. A packet labeled Insurance Updates for tax season. He said we needed it for liability restructuring. I signed those at this kitchen counter, distracted, halfway through sautéing onions. I remember the scent of garlic overpowering everything. I remember the ink smudging on the last page because my hands were damp from rinsing spinach. What I don't remember is ever agreeing to give up my share of the business I helped build from dirt. That night, I pulled out a magnifying glass and looked at the strokes of my own name. The pressure was different, more firm, less natural. Almost like it had been traced. I didn't scream, didn't throw things. I just sat there in the same chair I used to nurse Chester through his final days and whispered, this was never about partnership. It was about patience. The kind of patience that watches you cook, clean, sign, serve, until the moment you're no longer needed. I opened my laptop, created a new folder, and labeled it for the attorney. The upstairs door used to stay open, even when we argued, even when he needed space. But now it clicked shut every time he went up. He told me he was sorting financials, that the trust payout required concentration and no distractions. I didn't ask questions, not out loud. But I started to notice the patterns, how he'd carry his laptop pressed tight to his chest, how the light glowed under the door late into the night, how the wine from our best vintage kept disappearing bottle by bottle, always the expensive ones. One afternoon he forgot to lock it, or maybe he just assumed I wouldn't dare go in. The room smelled like cedar ink and old ambition. His desk was spotless except for the single glass still half full, a Bordeaux from the cellar we swore we'd open only on our 20th anniversary. I moved to the desk, fingers trembling not with fear but with clarity. The screen was still on, a spreadsheet. Dozens of tabs, one document titled An Asset Realignment Plan, Phase 2. I clicked. My name wasn't mentioned once. Not in distribution, not in revenue retention, not in forward projections. Instead, the notes read, all executive decisions to remain centralized. No need to complicate with legacy partner considerations. Legacy partner, like I was a ghost of the business, a relic, an obsolete file he forgot to delete. I printed the document, one copy only. Then I placed the wine glass on a coaster right where it had been and pulled the door shut behind me. The lock clicked this time, not from his side, but mine. The receipt was folded into a shallow crease and tucked inside his leather wallet, the one he left on the counter while he showered. $3,860.74, Alara and Company Private Styling Session, Seattle. I read it twice. He hadn't been to Seattle in months, at least not that I knew of. I searched the boutique online. It wasn't just high-end, it was invitation only. Appointments booked through a concierge. Clientele listed as media-sensitive professionals. And then on their Instagram, buried under glossy filters and luxury lighting, I saw him. In the corner of a video titled Fall Collection Preview, Soft Power Edit. He wasn't alone. She stood beside him laughing, holding a pair of champagne-colored heels, blonde, tall, perfectly framed against the mirror. The caption read Margot W. VP Acquisitions, stunning in our new silk blend. Margot. He once mentioned that name in a passing story about a merger that never happened. Smart, sharp, engaged to someone overseas, he said. Apparently not anymore. I paused the video, took a screenshot, zoomed in. His hand on the small of her back, the kind of touch that isn't friendly or professional or innocent. I didn't cry. I opened a drawer, pulled out a blank envelope, and slid the printed photo inside, labeled it Supplemental Exhibit B. Then I sat by the window watching the mist roll across the lake and whispered to myself, and you spent $4,000 on a woman's wardrobe with money from a company I built by hand. I stirred honey into my tea slow and steady, the way he always liked it. I smiled. But not for him. The moment it clicked was when I checked our domain email. My access was gone. The same address I'd used for 14 years to book contractors, respond to press-manage invoices, just locked out. System upgrade, he'd said casually last week. New security protocol, nothing personal. But I knew better. So I called Eli, our longtime web consultant. I kept my voice level, professional, predictable. Can you check when my access was revoked, I asked. There was a pause. Then he said, 3 weeks ago, Dahlia. Same day the new organizational chart went live. Organizational chart. I opened the company's shared drive. New folder. Whitmore Holdings. Restructure Q4. Inside a presentation prepared for investors. Logo redesigned. Motto rewritten. No mention of me, not in leadership, not in founders, not even in legacy credits. Instead, a line at the bottom read, Founded and operated by Callum Whitmore, 2009, present. I scrolled further. Page 12, a chart. 5 bullet points titled, Streamlining Post-Divorce Positioning. My name was listed once under Former Internal Support Non-Equity. Non-Equity. The woman who negotiated land rights during wildfire risk seasons, who sat through every zoning board meeting, who personally planted lavender to stabilize hillside erosion, was now labeled support. Not partner, not owner, not even footnote. Support, like a chair leg, replaceable, forgettable. That's when I understood. It wasn't just about Margot, or the inheritance, or even resentment. He wanted a clean portfolio, a founder's story without the woman who helped build the story. I closed the document, saved it as Exhibit C, and slid it into the folder marked as Strategic Erasure. Then I looked out across the water, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel hurt. I felt ready. The lavender didn't bloom this year. It should have. Late spring had been kind, just the right mix of rain and sun. But the hillside stayed bare, dry, colorless. I used to believe that lavender couldn't lie, that as long as it returned, things would be okay. We planted it the year Chester died. Callum dug the holes and I pressed each root in like a prayer. We watched it bloom together, two people who believed in second chances. But this year there was nothing, just brittle stems and soil that no longer held. I sat on the porch steps, folder on my lap, documents labeled A through C tucked neatly inside. And I whispered, "And you erased me on paper." Then I looked up at the ridge, the one we used to hike before things became contracts and campaigns. I remembered a day he said, "We'll be legends in this valley." Back then, I thought we meant we. Now I knew he always meant he. The lavender didn't bloom. But something else did. A quiet clarity, a stillness I hadn't known in years. I stood, dusted off my hands, and walked inside to call the only lawyer I trusted before I ever met him. My father's. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister. Not Eli, our web guy. Not even Carla from bookkeeping, who once cried when I mailed her Christmas cookies. Silence was my strategy. Callum liked noise, big reveals, public victories. I preferred systems, so I made one. First the folder, everything I had. The fake signature, the investor deck, the boutique photo, the revoked email access. I compiled into one single indexed PDF. Each page had a timestamp. Each exhibit had a digital backup. I printed 3 copies. One stayed with me, one went to a safe deposit box, and the third I slid across a polished oak table to pause. Walter Linden, my father's attorney of 20 years. He didn't blink once as he read, didn't ask why I waited. When he reached the line about non-equity partner, he exhaled slow, then said, "He tried to write you out, we'll write you back in louder." We discussed strategies. Civil litigation was possible, but public arbitration would hit harder. It would freeze assets, scare investors, shine a light on how trust and titles had been manipulated. Walter asked me what I wanted. Half, he said. Control name on paper, I said. And I want the truth filed, and I want it to be final. He nodded. No flourish, no sympathy, just clean, cold execution. That night, I went home and placed the first envelope, Exhibit A, back into the drawer where Callum once left the divorce papers. Then I poured myself a glass of the cheap wine, not the Bordeaux, the one he said tasted too sharp. I drank it slowly, watching the shadows stretch across the floor, not mourning, not raging, just preparing. Because revenge wasn't the goal. Correction was. The first call didn't go to Callum. It went to Harriet Mills, our lead investor, the same woman who once told me, "You're the spine of this whole thing. He's just the smile." I scheduled a meeting, no details, just one line. It concerns ownership integrity and misrepresentation in recent filings. by law as a silent co-founder with capital contributions and name documentation from 2011. I still had right of review on any restructure proposal affecting shared assets. Callum never bothered to rescind that clause. He probably forgot it existed. I hadn't. The board meeting was set for Thursday, virtual, private room, 10 attendees. Callum thought it was a quarterly check-in. He joined the call smiling, in blazer and tie with his wine shelf perfectly arranged behind him. He greeted everyone like usual until Harriet said, "Thus, before we review the Q4 numbers, Ms. Whitmore has requested the floor." He blinked, paused, laughed like it was some clerical error. But I was already on screen, hair tied back, no makeup, no pleasantries. Just 3 slides. 1. A timeline of the trust payout and the exact date he filed for divorce. 2. A forensic comparison of the forged signature he used on the deed transfer. 3. A scanned copy of the investor presentation that erased me with metadata, showing I still owned 43% of operational IP through original partnership filing. Callum didn't speak for 28 seconds. I counted. Then he said, This isn't necessary. We can talk, Dahlia." I looked straight into the lens. "We've already talked. You just didn't know I was listening." Harriet muted him. Then she said, "We'll need a recess and a full legal review." That's when I knew he was no longer the face, and I was no longer invisible. I clicked leave meeting, closed the laptop, exhaled. That was the first time I called myself by my full name out loud again. Dahlia Whitmore. Because the name you reclaim sounds sharper when you've been erased quietly. I didn't want his title. I didn't want the house. I didn't even want the vineyard lot we fought over in 2016. What I wanted was something clean. So I drafted an offer, full transfer of all my intellectual property rights, back to the company under 3 conditions. 1. A formal public acknowledgement of my role as co-founder and architect of early-stage growth. 2. A signed admission sealed but notarized of Callum's asset misrepresentation to be released only if he ever contested our divorce settlement. 3. My complete removal from future liability. No back taxes, no branding usage, no legacy debt. In return, he kept the company, the money, the story he always wanted to tell. Harriet reviewed the terms, the board signed. Walter filed everything before noon on Friday. That same afternoon, I mailed Callum a letter. 1 page, handwritten. "You always wanted your name on everything. Now you've got it, but you'll never own the part of me that remembers who built it first. Don't call, don't write, and for God's sake, don't publish a memoir. D." I left the house before sunset. No suitcase, just a weekender bag and a hard drive with every invoice I ever processed since 2010. As I walked down the gravel path for the last time, a hawk passed low overhead, its wings cutting the sky in two. And I thought, this isn't loss, this is redirection. He can keep the company, he can keep the land, but the silence that follows, that's mine. And I've earned every second of it. The first headline landed on Monday morning. Whitmore Holdings faces legal scrutiny over co-founder erasure. It wasn't me who leaked it. It was Harriet. She said the board had a right to protect its reputation, that they couldn't afford silence anymore, and I agreed. By Tuesday, 3 investors froze their quarterly contributions. 1 quietly pulled out entirely. By Wednesday, a local journalist published a timeline that looked eerily like mine. Slide-by-slide evidence I had indexed showed up in color-coded blocks, complete with quotes from archived board minutes and a small line at the end. And attempts to reach Miss Dahlia Whitmore for comment were declined. Because I didn't need to speak. The paper trail spoke louder than any voice I could have used. Callum tried to do damage control, He scheduled an emergency Q&A, released a statement about misunderstandings and internal restructuring missteps. But no one likes a man who rewrites history and gets caught mid-sentence. His face, once on the cover of Northwest Visionaries magazine, was now blurred behind press banners that said words like fraudulent omission and gendered corporate erasure. By Friday, he fired his publicist. By Sunday, his podcast was pulled from syndication. And on Monday, a client group in Bend filed a class action lawsuit citing false founder narrative for brand trust influence. I watched it all unfold from the back table of a quiet coffee shop in Astoria. I didn't flinch, didn't comment, didn't post. I just stirred a packet of raw sugar into my black coffee, read each article twice, then folded the printouts into a manila envelope labeled, "Not my fire, still my smoke," because that's what truth does. Even if they try to burn the files, even if they shut the doors and rewrite the credits, the smoke lingers, and someone always inhales it. 2 weeks after the headlines faded, a letter arrived. Cream envelope, no return address, handwritten, his handwriting. It was delivered to my P.O. box, the one no one knew I kept except my accountant and Walter. I didn't open it. I slid it into the drawer beneath my new lease agreement, the one for the art studio I now rented on the second floor, above an independent bookstore facing the harbor. Some endings don't need punctuation, they just need to stop. A week later, Harriet forwarded me a note from Callum's new interim CEO. He'd stepped down voluntarily, citing mental health reflection and time needed for family realignment. There was no family, not anymore. Margot had moved to Vancouver, quietly, deleted her LinkedIn. Someone on Reddit said she'd been seen crying at the Seattle airport, but the thread got buried. The company rebranded. They dropped the name Whitmore, went with you Ridge and Comfortable, fresh start. Same bones. But not mine. I'd sold my remaining 7% quietly through a third-party trust on a Tuesday morning with no phone call, no meeting, no press. Just a wire transfer and a close tab. That night, I walked down to the shore with a thermos of peppermint tea and watched the boats pass slowly against a fog that didn't apologize for rolling in. In my coat pocket, the envelope still sat unopened, uncreased, unimportant. I never sent it back, but I never read it either. Some truths don't belong in ink, and some apologies arrive too late to be translated. I took the envelope out, held it over the driftwood fire I'd built small, steady, and I let it fall. No anger, no smile. Just a silence that didn't need to be broken to be understood. It wasn't a fancy office. Just a second-story room with creaky floors and old radiator pipes that hissed in winter like they had something to say. But the nameplate on the door, it was mine. Dahlia L. Whitmore, Studio 2B Creative Residency, workshops by appointment, no shared credit, no brand merging, no man's surname beside mine. I ran a series of writing retreats, small ones, 6 women at a time. A kettle, a circle of chairs, and a stack of blank notebooks with a quote on the first page. And you don't need to explain why you stayed, but you do deserve to say why you left. Some cried, some raged, some laughed at how long it took them to say I was erased out loud. We never used the word revenge. We used clarity, we used closure, we used I'm still here. I didn't tell them my full story, only the parts that helped. Only the truths that healed sideways. On Thursdays, I taught at the community college again. Poetry this time, not business writing. My students were quiet, soft-eyed, and full of questions about what it meant to say something simply but say it well. Sometimes after class, I'd walk to the old bookstore below my studio and read travel essays I'd never take the time to write myself. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to go anywhere to feel like I'd arrived. One afternoon, as I was locking up, a woman in her 60s approached. Gray sweater, kind mouth. She said, "Are you the Dahlia from Whitmore Ridge?" I paused, then smiled gently. "I used to be," I said. "Now I'm just Dahlia." She nodded, like she understood more than I said, then added, "You're the reason I canceled my silent apology," and walked away. I stood in the hallway for a long minute, breathing in the smell of dry books and metal heaters. I thought about the house by the river, the lavender that never bloomed, the contract I signed with Steam, still on my fingers. I didn't regret it. None of it, because every woman I sit with now, every story I hold, every quiet yes that leaves someone's throat is worth more than any stake in any company I was never supposed to survive without. There's a picture above my desk. It's not Callum, not me either. It's just a hillside brown with time and a single sprig of lavender blooming where the rest had given up. No caption, no filter, no hashtag. But every time I looked at it, I hear my own voice saying, the name they tried to erase still fits just fine.